In the year 1092 from the birth of Christ, the Persian mountains of Elburz concealed something so monstrous that even crusaders who had witnessed the slaughter of Jerusalem paled at the mention of this place. The fortress of Alamut, an eagle's nest perched on a cliff over 2,000 meters high, emanated a sickly sweet smoke in which the aromas of opium, rose oil, and human fear mingled. Within its walls, the old man Hassan-i Sabbah had created a killing machine that ran on ecstasy and religious madness, a machine that devoured young souls and spat out merciless assassins who went to their deaths with smiles of bliss on their lips. The fortress grew from gray stone, as if it were a continuation of the mountain itself, its towers vanishing into the clouds, its narrow embrasures resembling the empty eye sockets of a skull. The only road to the gates wound along the edge of an abyss where the wind howled, so that it seemed the earth itself groaned in pain. Here, in this stone sarcophagus, Hassan-i Sabbah had ruled for 20 years, transforming Ismaili heresy into a weapon of terror. The old man, who had reached 64 years of age, was thin as a skeleton, his beard bleached to the color of old bone, and his eyes had sunk so deep they seemed like wells into another world. He had not left his cell for years, spending his days studying sacred texts and compiling lists of those who should die. The fortress's inner courtyard was a labyrinth of shadowed galleries where stone columns were covered with Arabic script verses from the Quran, intertwined with Ismaili philosophical treatises. The air here was humid and cold, smelling of damp stone, incense, and something else. A barely perceptible odor of decay emanating from the deep dungeons. These dungeons stored not only reserves of grain and weapons, but something more valuable, enormous stocks of hashish brought by caravans from distant lands. Green resin in clay pots awaited its hour to transform ordinary youths into hashishin hashish eaters, those whom the world would later call assassins. Hassan selected his students with the meticulousness of a jeweler choosing precious stones. He needed boys between 12 and 16 years old, young enough that their minds had not yet hardened, but strong enough to endure training. He sent his agents to villages where hunger and poverty made families pliable. Parents were promised that their sons would become scholars, warriors of the faith, defenders of true Islam. Boys were brought to the fortress in chains, 5 or 6 at a time, their eyes widening in terror at the sight of the precipices and impregnable walls. The first weeks they were kept in semi-darkness, fed sparsely, forced to pray 15 times a day until their will broke like a dry twig under a boot. But the real training began later, when the old man decided that a youth was ready to see paradise. At these moments, a silent servant would enter the cell with a bowl filled with a thick drink the color of congealed blood. The drink was sweet, cloying, with hints of honey, rose water, and something bitter that burned the throat. The youth would drink, not knowing that dissolved in the liquid was such a dose of hashish that even an experienced smoker would lose his mind. Within minutes, the world would begin to swim, the cell walls would dissolve, and darkness would swallow everything. Awakening was like being born into another universe. The youth would open his eyes and see not the gray stone of the fortress, but a sky of an impossible blue that did not exist in the real world. The air was filled with the fragrance of jasmine, rose, and some unearthly incense that made the head spin. Under his back, he felt not a rough mat, but the softest silk embroidered with golden threads. Nearby, water gurgled, Not a dirty stream from a mountain spring, but a crystalline flow running through a bed of white marble. Trees around him bent under the weight of fruit pomegranates the size of a child's head, grapes in clusters an arm's length long, dates oozing honeyed juice. This was the secret garden of Alamut, hidden in the very heart of the fortress, in a deep ravine where ordinary eyes could not penetrate. Hassan had built it over 10 years, transporting soil and saplings on the backs of mules, laying underground water channels, creating an artificial oasis in the midst of a stone desert. The garden was surrounded by high walls, painted with frescoes images of the paradisiacal groves from the Quran. Pavilions with gilded domes, pools lined with turquoise tiles, fountains spouting jets in which rose petals floated. But the most stunning thing was not the architecture or the plants. It was the inhabitants of this place. Girls appeared like visions. There were 20 or 30 of them, all between 15 and 20 years old, each a beauty selected from hundreds. Their hair was black as pitch or golden as wheat, their skin white as moonlight or dusky as cinnamon. They wore translucent garments of the finest silk through which the forms of young bodies showed. Their wrists jingled with bracelets, their ankles adorned with chains bearing little bells, and their eyes were lined with kohl so artfully that a single glance made the heart beat faster. They moved as if dancing, their laughter like the chiming of crystal goblets, their touches softer than petals. The youth, drugged by hashish and the sudden change of reality, could not understand what was happening to him. The last thing he remembered was the gray cell, hunger, and prayers. Now girls surrounded him, offering fruit and wine, real wine, forbidden in Islam, but here flowing in rivers. They fed him grapes, placing berries directly in his mouth, their fingers touching his lips, leaving a trail of fire. They sang songs in Farsi and Arabic, recited poetry about love and bliss. When he tried to speak, to ask where he was, they only laughed and said, "You are in paradise, beloved. You died for the faith, and now your reward is eternal." Days in the garden, or rather 3 days and 3 nights passed in a haze of pleasures. The youth was bathed in pools of warm water scented with oils. Girls massaged his body, their hands gliding over his skin, awakening sensations he had never known. At night they came to him, and what happened in the pavilions under the starry sky erased the last boundaries between dream and reality. Food was so abundant and delicious that he ate until his stomach was heavy, but hunger returned strangely quickly. Wine flowed endlessly, but the intoxication was special, not heavy and dull, but light, like flight. He did not know that each cup contained a new dose of hashish, keeping him in a state of controlled madness. On the 4th day, everything ended as suddenly as it began. The youth would fall asleep in the embrace of a beautiful houri and wake on the cold stone floor of his cell. The transition was so abrupt and brutal that many screamed, some wept, clutching at the air trying to recapture the vanished paradise. The body ached, the mouth tasted bitter, the head split with pain. Gray walls pressed in, cold wind from the courtyard penetrated through cracks, the smell of dampness and mold replaced the incense. Reality crashed down like an avalanche, burying all the bliss he had experienced. It was at this moment that Hassan-i Sabbah would arrive. The old man would enter the cell, leaning on a staff of black wood, his white beard nearly touching the floor, his eyes glowing with fanatic conviction. He would sit beside the crushed youth and begin speaking in a quiet, almost tender voice. He would explain that what the youth had experienced was not a dream. It was the real paradise Jannah, promised by the Prophet Muhammad to believers. He, Hassan, servant of the hidden Imam, had received the power to open and close the gates of paradise at his discretion. The youth had been there once, had tasted the bliss that awaited the righteous. But there was a way to return there forever. The path was simple and terrible at once. The youth had to become a fidai, one who sacrifices himself. Hassan would give an assignment to kill a person whose name was written in a sealed scroll. It could be a governor of a distant city, a wealthy merchant, a religious leader, sometimes even a sultan or vizier. It did not matter how well the target was guarded, how inaccessible he was. The fidai had to find a way to approach him and plunge in a dagger. Death while carrying out the mission was not an end. It was instant return to the garden where houris awaited the hero, where rivers of wine flowed eternally, where there was no pain or fear. Death was not punishment, but reward. The psychological mechanism was perfect. The youth who had experienced 3 days in paradise could not reconcile himself to returning to the gray reality of the fortress. Memories of soft hands, sweet wine, fragrant gardens tore him apart from within. Each day in the cell was torture compared to what he had lost. Hassan was not hasty, gave a week or two for the longing to become unbearable. Some youths begged to be returned to the garden, were ready for anything. Others resisted, but isolation, meager food, constant sermons about duty to the faith broke even the most steadfast. In the end, almost all agreed. Training in murder began after the oath. The youths were taught to wield the dagger, a short, curved blade that could be hidden in the folds of clothing. They were trained to thrust it into dummies, aiming for points where a strike brought instant death, under the ribs into the heart, at the base of the skull, into the throat. They were taught to creep silently, blend into crowds, change appearance, speak in different dialects. But most importantly, they were taught fanatic conviction. Every evening the fidai gathered in a hall where Hassan or his lieutenants delivered sermons about the greatness of Ismaili teaching, about the corruption of Sunni rulers, about how their mission was sacred. Murder was not a sin. It was an act of purifying the world, removing an obstacle on the path to true faith. The first missions of the fidai from Alamut shook the Islamic world at the end of the 11th century. In the year 1092, Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, one of the greatest minds of the age, was traveling in a palanquin on a road near Isfahan. Around him was a guard of 50 warriors, but this did not save him. A young man dressed as a dervish approached the palanquin under the pretext of receiving alms. The next moment he plunged a dagger into the vizier's chest, the blade passing between ribs with surgical precision. The killer did not try to flee. He stood with the bloodied knife in his hand and smiled while guards cut him down with swords. According to eyewitness accounts, he died with words of gratitude on his lips, as if he were being released from prison. This was not a single murder, but the beginning of a campaign of terror that would last decades. Hassan compiled a list of 300 names, rulers, judges, theologians, all who opposed the Ismailis or were simply unwelcome. Each name meant a death sentence that could be carried out in a month or in years, but sooner or later a fidai would find his target. Assassins infiltrated palaces disguised as servants, worked as gardeners in emirs' courtyards, became bodyguards to those they were meant to kill. Their patience was limitless, their devotion absolute. Especially terrifying was that the killers never tried to save themselves. This contradicted all norms of political assassination of that era. Usually, a hired killer wanted to survive, collect his money, and disappear. The Fidei, however, acted like living bombs. The inevitability of death did not stop them. On the contrary, they seemed to seek it. This sowed panic among rulers. How to defend against someone who does not fear death? How to anticipate a strike if the assassin is willing to wait years? Sultans began sleeping in different rooms each night, surrounded themselves with multiple layers of security, ceased trusting even close relatives. But the murders continued. In the fortress of Alamut, Hassan received reports of completed missions with cold satisfaction. Each death strengthened his power and the Ismailis' reputation. He himself never left the fortress, according to some accounts. In the last 20 years of his life, he left his cell only twice, both times merely to the flat roof of a tower. He became a ghost, an idea, a symbol of invincible and invisible evil. Caravans whispered about the old man of the mountain who with one gesture could send an assassin to the ends of the earth. Ambassadors came to Alamut with gifts and pleas for mercy. Hassan accepted the gifts, but rarely gave guarantees. The girls in the secret garden were replaced every few years. When they became too old or lost their freshness, they were led out of the fortress with pouches of gold and a warning to keep silent on pain of death. Some disappeared without trace. There were rumors they were thrown into the abysses so the garden's secret would not become known to the world. New ones were brought in their place, purchased from slave traders, kidnapped from poor villages, sometimes taken as daughters of defeated enemies. They were trained in the art of seduction, but not told the true purpose. The girls thought they served in the harem of a powerful ruler, not suspecting they were part of a gigantic theater of death. Rumors about the assassins reached the Crusaders in the early 12th century when knights encountered Ismailis in Syria, where they had captured several fortresses. Frankish chroniclers recorded the stories with horror and fascination. They described youths who threw themselves on enemy swords without hesitation, who smiled as they died, who could not be intimidated or bribed. The word assassin entered European languages, spawning legends of a sect of killers controlled by a mysterious heretic magician. Some details were exaggerated, but the essence remained true. There existed a group that had turned murder into religious ritual and used drugs to control consciousness. Hassan himself died in the year 1124 at the age of 90, never having left Alamut. According to legend, the old man's last words were, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," a phrase that became the motto of the assassins. But the machine he had created survived him. His successors continued using the secret garden, continued training Fidei, continued sending killers to targets throughout the Islamic world. The fortress of Alamut held for another 130 years, until in the year 1256 the Mongols came with a vast army. The Mongol siege was merciless. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, surrounded the fortress on all sides, blocked the only road, set up catapults on surrounding peaks. The bombardment lasted for weeks, stone projectiles smashing towers and walls. But the most terrible thing the Mongols did was when they stormed inside. They sought not treasures, they sought knowledge and the secrets of the Ismailis. The library of Alamut, one of the largest in Persia, containing tens of thousands of manuscripts on philosophy, science, and heresy, was burned completely. The Mongol historian Juvayni was present and later wrote that he saw fire devour treatises that could have changed understanding of the world. The secret garden was discovered on the third day after the conquest. Mongol warriors descended into the ravine and froze, seeing an oasis in the midst of destruction. Trees still bore fruit, fountains still functioned thanks to underground channels, pavilions stood untouched. But the girls were gone. According to some accounts, the fortress's defenders killed them all before capitulation, so they would not fall to the enemy. According to other sources, the girls were evacuated through secret tunnels days before the fall. The truth was lost in the chaos of the slaughter that followed. Hulagu Khan ordered the execution of all men in the fortress, about 2,000 people. Their bodies were thrown into the abysses, the very ones above which Alamut had towered for 2 centuries. The garden itself the Mongols destroyed methodically. They cut down the trees, smashed the marble pools, demolished the pavilions, filled the channels with stones. Within a month, no trace of the oasis remained, only a bare ravine in the rock. The fortress became ruins. Its towers collapsed, its walls cracked. Wind howled through empty corridors where once prayers and groans of drugged youths had sounded. Alamut became a ghost, a reminder that even the most sophisticated system of controlling human consciousness is not eternal. But the story did not end in the year 1256. The idea born in the gardens of Alamut survived the fortress. Throughout the Islamic world, scattered groups of Ismailis remained who remembered Hassan's teaching. Some of them continued practicing initiation rituals, using opiates and hashish to create religious visions. In the 18th century, British travelers visiting Persia recorded accounts of sects that allegedly led recruits to secret gardens and showed them paradise before sending them on suicidal missions. How true these stories are is difficult to say. The boundary between history and legend had blurred by that time. The word assassin itself became generic, penetrated dozens of languages, spawned images in literature and popular culture. Few of those who use this word know about Hassan-i Sabbah, about the secret garden in Alamut, about the youths who died smiling, believing they were returning to the embrace of houris. But the essence remains, the technology of creating a fanatic through manipulation of consciousness and the promise of posthumous bliss proved too effective to disappear. It was repeated in different forms, in different cultures, in different eras. Archaeologists who visited the ruins of Alamut in the 20th century found only piles of stones atop the cliff. The secret ravine with the garden was identified by indirect signs, remains of destroyed channels, fragments of marble tiles buried under layers of mud and stones. No golden pavilions, no fountains, only desolation and the silence of wind. But local inhabitants still avoid this place. They say that at night sounds come from the ruins, women's laughter, the splash of water, the scent of roses, though nothing grows there but dry shrubs. The most horrifying part of the story is not the murders, not the manipulations, not the ruined lives of thousands of youths. The most terrible thing is how easily it worked. Hassan-i Sabbah invented nothing new. He simply combined 3 elements: religious fanaticism, consciousness-altering substances, and the promise of paradise. This formula proved so powerful that the human mind capitulated without resistance. Youths who could have become scholars, merchants, fathers of families, were transformed into living weapons, and the most frightening thing, they were happy. They went to their deaths not from fear, not from compulsion, but from ecstatic desire to return to the state they had experienced once. Hassan did not simply kill them, he made them love their own destruction. When the Mongols burned Alamut's library, among the manuscripts was a diary of one of Hassan's close associates, in which he described experiments with hashish dosages, duration of stays in the garden, combinations of drugs to achieve maximum effect. The diary turned to ash, but one fragment supposedly survived in the retelling of the historian Juveni. It said that the most difficult moment was not making a youth kill, but making him return from the garden alive if the mission required it. Because once having experienced paradise, a person no longer wanted to live in reality. He was ready to die here and now, just to return there. The machine Hassan created was so perfect that its most difficult task became not turning people into killers, but preventing their suicide before completing the order.